25, 2020 meeting of the San Rafael Planning Commission. Will you please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We'll note that all planning commissioners are present tonight. At this time, are there any requests to revise the order of the items on the agenda? Hearing none, I'll move on to the public notification of the meeting procedures. We have one public hearing on the agenda tonight, and that's the matter of 190 Mill Street, the homeward bound application to expand its operations at the corner of Mill and Harbor to add supportive housing and increase the emergency shelter. During the hearing, we will first have a staff report. First, I'm going to ask commissioners if they wish to disclose any ex-parte communications they may have had about the matter and any potential conflicts of interest that they may have in relation to the matter. Then we're going to have a staff report, and that will be followed by a presentation from the applicant. Then members of the public will be invited to speak. And if you do plan to speak, we ask that you limit your remarks to 3 minutes or less. If somebody has already spoken, expressed your viewpoint, you may feel free to say, I echo that viewpoint. When you come up, if you want to speak, please speak into the mic. We may have some people in the audience this evening who have some hearing difficulties, so try to keep your voice up, keep your mouth close to the mic. I'll try to do the same from up here. And if you would please let us know who you are before you start speaking, and before you return to your seat, if you'll please fill out the sheet over here so we have a record of who was here tonight speaking. The commission will have an opportunity to ask questions of the staff, of the applicant, and if they wish to do so, of any speakers at the podium during those three parts of the hearing. Once all the members of the public have spoken, I'll close the public hearing. The commission will then have a chance to ask what further questions they may have of staff or the applicant, and then we will bring it back to the commission to deliberate and make a decision on the application that is before us tonight. Next, I'd like to ask whether there are any matters of an urgent nature on which anybody wishes to speak that are not on the agenda tonight. Does anybody wish to approach and speak on something not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we're going to move on to the next item, which is the approval of the minutes of the last meeting of February 11. Has everyone had a chance to look at those minutes? And if so, are there any suggested changes to the minutes before we call for a vote? Hearing no suggested changes, all in favor, may I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
In a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that the minutes of the February 11, 2020 meeting be approved as submitted. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? I think Commissioner Samuzi was not here last time, so he will abstain. We'll now call the public hearing on the matter of 190 Mill Street. And before we start, I'm going to ask whether any commissioner wishes to make disclosure of any ex-parte communications a commissioner may have had, or any potential conflicts of interest a commissioner may have with respect to this matter. I want to disclose that I did do a site visit 2:30 in the afternoon today and walked around, and I observed the current site and some of the neighborhood. I was paying particular attention to the surrounding properties, the parking on the street, and looking specifically for trash and debris and other items that have been raised in some of the communications to the commission. With that, I'll turn, is there another?
No, I was just going to say, I guess I didn't necessarily see site visits as being ex parte communication. So I also did a site visit, as I'm imagining most of the people here did. So I just want to make sure that we're ultimately, we need to be clear as whether visiting the site is something we need to disclose. It seems to me something we should be doing.
I agree, and I'm making this disclosure because I observed things that touched on some of the comments made in the letters submitted to the commission, and so I want people to be aware of that there's information that was presented to us ahead of time that may be inconsistent with or may touch upon matters that are in the prior written communication. So and that's the reason I'm making that disclosure. So I think we're still uncertain about the rule on site visits, but that's the purpose of my disclosure. If there's no other disclosures at this time, I call on staff to give us your report, please.
Thank you, Chair Shopert. I'd like to, at this point, introduce Janie Alsep. She is a contract planner that is helping us during our dire time of need. We have, as you know, we have a planner shortage, and Janie has been really helpful helping us with a number of projects, including the 190 Mill Street project. So I will let her take it away.
Good evening, Chair Shopert and members of the Commission. This evening we're here to review the project proposed at 190 Mill Street by Homeward Bound of Marin. There is quite a bit of information in your staff report along with the attachments, and I prepared a few slides just to go over the high points in terms of the background contained in the staff report. As many of you already know, and as was discussed back when we had a study session, the state has recently adopted legislation related to housing and housing production, quite a bit of it as a matter of fact. Many of it obligates municipalities to establish streamlined by right processes for qualifying housing projects. And projects that meet affordability and other criteria must be evaluated through the by right process that's been established now by the state, where only objective standards can be applied. California legislation includes SB 2, which provides funding for programs that facilitate housing production. And as discussed at the outset, there was a Planning Commission study session that was conducted back in December of last year, where we went over quite a bit of this new legislation, including the by right process and objective standards. We also, at that study session, talked about possible city-initiated legislative changes that would facilitate more affordable housing projects. This included some changes to allow and expand areas for height bonuses and other changes that were contemplated at that time that we solicited input on. We also reviewed this specific project at 190 Mill Street, which, as presented at the study session, includes a request for a general plan amendment, a zoning map amendment, and a use permit. At that study session, we received some feedback, helpful feedback from the Commission at that time, and the feedback essentially is boiled down into two main points: that the city-initiated changes were premature and perhaps too broad to consider at that time, given that we do not yet have this list of objective standards that the city has been working on and reported previously. And also, the formal project review would need to respond to a couple of issues that were brought up. One is better justification for the requested amendments, given that the surrounding area is primarily industrial uses and industrial designation, and also how the applicant intends to address site maintenance related to the emergency shelter. There was a speaker at the study session that raised some concerns about that, and we'll get into some of the more recent public comments later in the presentation. So we took the feedback from the commission and for now have tabled the city-initiated legislation that was presented as part of the study session. We understand that it is maybe a little bit too much too soon in terms of the broader scope of those legislative changes. So just for anybody who's been tuning in since the study session, just to make it clear, the projects that are before you this evening are specifically for 190 Mill Street only. They don't encompass or involve any other properties. So what is proposed is the construction of a new building that would be 4 levels. It would be 3 levels on top of a concrete podium parking structure that would provide 18 parking spaces for use by staff, service providers, and guests, and residents would not have cars, so this would be for the emergency shelter that would be located on the first floor above the podium. It would be for a 60-bed emergency shelter that would replace the existing shelter. In addition, what is proposed are 32 single-room occupancy supportive housing units that would be on the 2nd and 3rd floors. And then there would also be associated site improvements, including landscaping and fencing along the property. There are 3 specific requests as far as the applications that have been submitted. One is for a general plan amendment that would change the existing light industrial office designation of the site to high-density residential. And so that's a general plan map amendment change. There are no text amendments proposed to the general plan, nor are they required for this project. The second is, well, let me just show you. There's a before and after that shows the existing general plan designation and what would be proposed. And just to show that the proposed amendment to high-density residential would essentially extend the high-density designations that are to the north and northeast of the site along Canal. There is an accompanying zoning map amendment that would also modify the Canal Core Industrial Office designation to the high-density residential, which is in concert with the general plan amendments. And again, this would just be a map amendment. There are no text amendments to the ordinance required. And similarly, you see that HR1 district that occurs to the north and the northeast would extend to the project site. And the third is a use permit. And the use permit, I should say, as noted in the staff report, the existing emergency shelter has been operating since 1986 under a use permit. The use permit before you this evening would also be brought to the City Council after your recommendation, along with the general plan and zoning amendment, since all of the entitlements basically are bundled and go to the entity that has the ultimate approval authority. And the use permit in this case would address the replacement emergency shelter, the new emergency shelter that is proposed to have a maximum of 60 beds. And in our zoning ordinance and also consistent with state law, there are specific findings related to emergency shelters, which are enumerated in your staff report. And these are also included in your resolutions for approval on the use permit. In addition, the applicant is requesting 2 concessions as is permitted under both state law and our local ordinance. And it says density bonuses, but it's actually density bonuses and concessions. It covers a wide array of possible offerings that would allow for incentives for affordable housing projects such as this one. I should mention, too, that the proposed units for the supportive housing are 100% affordable. So they qualify to request an incentive, and the applicant has requested two. One, to exceed the maximum lot coverage, which for the HR1 district is 60%, and the other is for the height limit. I think they have another slide here. So the lot coverage for this site translates to 8,100 square feet. The site itself is 13,500 square feet. And the applicant is requesting the concession that would allow for a 66% lot coverage. And the second is for the height limit. The height limit in the HR1 district is 36 feet. The applicant is requesting an increase for up to 48 feet, although I should note that the building height, as we do measure building height, is, I believe, about 45 and 3/4 feet. So it was felt that allowing some slight additional height may be appropriate in this case, and also the 12-foot increase from the 36 feet would be consistent with what is allowed in other areas for for affordable housing projects. This would also allow for the habitable space to all be located and brought up above the FEMA base flood elevation of 10 feet established for the site, and allow for the 3 levels above the emergency shelter and 2 supportive housing units, all above the base flood elevation. There's been a lot of talk about the objective standards, the by right ministerial process, both in the study session and in other presentations given to you, as well as this evening. And the city, this is really just a continuation of what staff has been working on to try to continue to provide more streamlined process for affordable housing projects, which we want to encourage. The first draft of the standards were presented last year, and feedback was received, so that's progress is being made, and there's more direction that more work was needed to focus on the objective standards. So this project is here before the city today for consideration. It's before the list of objective standards have been fully developed, and it really serves as a pilot program for the by right process that this project and other similar projects that we hope to see coming forward would be able to take advantage of as mandated by the state now. So in addition to looking at this project and the design features and the design standards for this project, we would appreciate receiving any feedback that you have on how these standards could be applied to other projects, or if there are things that you think should be considered that we haven't, or items related to this project that you feel may or may not be appropriate to include ultimately in this list of objective standards that we'll be using once finalized for other similar projects. So we'd like to invite the commission to share those thoughts with us, even though it is not a formal consideration that will be forwarded to the City Council for their consideration. It would be helpful for us to receive any feedback that you'd like to provide on that to us this evening. Because the project involves a request for a general plan amendment and a zoning amendment, these actions are not considered exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. Therefore, an initial study was prepared for the project, primarily focusing on the legislative amendments that are proposed. The initial study was circulated for a 20-day review period beginning January 2nd, ending on January 22nd. And the 3 areas where potential impacts may occur are primarily related to construction activity, and that would be the potential for cultural resources to be discovered, geology and soils, and tribal cultural resources. Other projects can be mitigated to a less than significant level, and these three areas are where mitigation measures have been identified, and they're included in the mitigation monitoring and reporting program, which is also included in the attached initial study and mitigated negative declaration. I should mention that on tribal cultural resources, and as noted in the in the staff report, there was an offer of tribal consultation to our local tribe, and that is required by state law. There was no response requesting a consultation by the tribe, but we have made sure that we did adhere to all of the appropriate notifications for general plan amendments. So we have 4 recommendations, and again, the recommendations in on the Planning Commission's action this evening, they're in the form of recommendations to the City Council, and that would be for the Planning Commission to recommend to the City Council adoption of the mitigated negative declaration and approval of the MMRP that it contains the mitigation measures. Adoption of the general plan amendment that would change the existing LIO designation of the site to high-density residential on the land use map in the general plan, an accompanying adoption of a zoning amendment to modify the zoning map classification from the Canal Corps Industrial Office to high-density residential, HR1, and approval of a use permit for the new emergency shelter that would replace the existing shelter, and consideration of the 2 concessions, one for maximum lot coverage and one for the building height limit. With that, that concludes the staff presentation, and I'd be happy to address any questions now or after the architect has had an opportunity to present, make their presentation.
Okay, I think I'll go ahead and give the commission an opportunity to ask questions. It occurs to me that we have potentially 3 different subject matter areas that we're dealing with tonight. The first is with respect to this project, the initial study and the adequacy of the environmental review. The second is the merits on the project, including the general plan amendment and the use permit. And the third area is the request for feedback on objective standards. So if I may, I'd like to ask commissioners to divide their questions along those lines. And I'll first start with the initial study and the environmental review, and ask if any commissioners have questions of staff about anything contained in the initial study checklist or the mitigations. Okay, hearing that, I'll move on to the merits. Does anyone up here have questions of staff on the general plan amendment, the rezoning, or the use permit conditions and the resolutions related to that? Any questions of staff? Commissioner Loughran.
Just a couple questions. So one of them is just the overall process here, that if the Planning Commission approves this project, it goes to City Council for final review. If we deny it, does it still go to City Council, or would the applicant need to appeal it for it to go to City Council?
So the recommendation would be to the City Council. So you would be recommending denial of the general plan amendment and zoning map amendment. And then the City Council would still be making that decision.
Okay, great, thank you. So on page 6 of the staff report, it talks about the fact that the objective design standards don't exist, but it indicates that there are objective, that the city does have adopted development standards. Are those what's laid out on page 13 for the use permit, or where are those that have been adopted that would be applied to the ministerial by right process?
It's for the HR1.
So the development standards are included. They're basically the setbacks, lot coverage, those types of things are for the development itself. Separately, we also have performance standards that are applicable to the emergency shelter. So they're two sets of objective type standards that we've applied to this, that would be applied to this project.
Okay, so are the ones that are specific to emergency, I'm sorry, yep, emergency shelters, are those the ones that are listed on page 13?
Yes.
Okay, so those apply to emergency shelters, not to the other units, the other 32 units?
Correct.
Okay.
Because those are, those are supportive it's considered supportive housing. We are not allowed to apply anything that we would normally apply to a residential development
Okay.
or supportive housing.
Okay, so then are the other objective standards that you mentioned, are they in this document?
There-
Yes. Page 11 and 13 is where there's, measurable standards. Their development standards are basically what that is just, setbacks, lot coverage, height, that sort of thing.
Okay. And that's the two areas in which a concession has been requested, one to height and one to lot coverage?
Correct.
Okay, all right, great. Another question I have is that on page 12, it talks about distance from transit and the fact that AB 2162, there's certain concessions if that location is within a half-mile of public transit. And then it goes on to say that this location is a quarter-mile from the Medway Road transit stop. How does AB 2162 define transit? Or do they? In other words, is a bus stop considered, is that included in the law's definition of transit?
Yes, and I don't know don't have the exact language, but it is, it's got to have a number, like a frequency of stops, or it's got to be a route and it has to have a frequency of stops throughout the day, and I don't recall exactly what that number is, but
I think it's it's like one for every 15 minutes or something like that, with a certain rotation and length of the trip.
Okay.
So it is defined in there.
Okay, and does the Medway Road transit stop meet those standards?
yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Great, okay, thank you. One more question I had, perhaps you could put the map back up that shows the, maybe the first map that showed the change in the, general plan amendment. So it's sort of hard to tell, but if you go to the site and go kitty corner to it, driving by today, it seemed to me that that was also housing. And I see that it's, the general plan designation is M, which I'm going to guess is for Marin. But I just wanted to confirm, in M, how much of that is housing?
I don't know, I can look that up while we proceed with the applicant's presentation.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. That's all I have for now.
Other commissioner questions of staff on the project merits? I've got a couple. In the portion related to the environmental review, there's a looks like there's a landscape plan, but I'm not sure I saw in the large sheet that we were provided a landscape plan. Is there a landscape plan for this? If so, do we have a slide on it?
I do not have a slide.
I'm sorry, I'm being corrected. It's in there. I just didn't see all the pretty color pictures of the trees, and so I have a hard time recognizing it as a landscape. Okay, that's fine. That's good. The other question I had is, in the industrial area that borders this site, there are many auto-related uses, especially auto repair-related uses. Does the zoning ordinance or development standards for that particular use have any on-site parking requirements?
Yes, we do have on-site I don't know what that ratio is, but there is on-site parking requirements. some of the parking requirements and storage requirements kind of overlap, but I don't have the ratio for you.
Right, thank you. So I have well, no, I'm going to hold off on that. Okay. Any more questions on the merits of staff at this time? Okay, I'd like to move on to something I think Commissioner Loughran's already touched on this, but that's the input on the developing the objective standards. And thank you for your questions, Commissioner Loughran. I think they were illuminating. And does anybody else have questions on that subject? So I just like to be clear, just confirm what I think I heard is that we're dealing with two kinds of objective standards tonight for which staff would like input. One is on the development standards generally for building in this area, and the second is for the objective standards that relate specifically to emergency shelters. Is that right?
That's correct. There are two different sets of objective standards. One is just development standards that are applied to high-density residential developments, and the others are what we call performance standards that apply to emergency shelters only.
And then on the development standards, the staff report makes clear that the city worked collaboratively with the applicant. And I guess my question is, if you're asking us for feedback, are you asking us for feedback for more than the objective development standards that are on page 11? Were there some more that were applied to this project for which you'd like input? Finishes, articulation, choice of windows, anything? Is there anything else that we don't see, doesn't jump out at us in our packet that you'd like comments on?
So I think you're referring to Janie Alsup's comment on the project itself, the building itself. I think one of the requests is that if there's anything on, in that building that associated with that building design-wise that you would like to provide feedback on. As Janie said, we're looking at really kind of nailing down our objective standards. We brought those objective standards for design-related standards to the Design Review Board and the Planning Commission late last year, and there's much work to be done still. And so we are, as we look at refining those, and we consider this project kind of a pilot project for, future supportive housing projects. And so, yeah, I mean, what we're really looking for from you is if there's any feedback that you would like to provide us related to the design of the proposed project tonight, that we would be appreciative of that.
Okay, a slight follow-up. We have a by right process under Assembly Bill 2162 that applies to supportive housing applications. We also have there's some other statutes out there, and there may be more to come. I'm thinking specifically of Senate Bill 35. Are the restrictions on the ability to impose objective standards for AB 2162 projects different than for the other by right statutes that currently exist? I mean, are we more proscribed in imposing development standards on projects that meet the requirements of 2162 than we would be for some other by right projects?
That's a good question. I don't know that we're there yet. I think we're looking at how to structure the by right objective design standards. One idea is to just identify objective design standards that could be applied to anything that's a by right process. And another idea might be the way you describe it, where we have, one set of standards for the SB 35, another set of standards for AB 2162, and whatever other legislation might be out there. That might be more difficult to work through. So my guess is that we're going to try to establish just one set of objective design standards that we could apply to all of the by right.
And if I could add, I mean, the key is objective. They all need to be clear, objective standards that can be applied in a ministerial process. And then one other comment is I think we're really looking for the input on the development standards that would apply to the building design more so than the actual performance standards for the emergency shelter, because the state law, the performance standards that are for the emergency shelters are essentially consistent with what is in state law, and I'm not sure that we would have the opportunity really to broaden those beyond what is currently allowed by state law.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Okay, final call for questions on the development of objective standards.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Mine is really quick. These objective standards through the pilot program, is there a plan to bring updated objective standards continuously to the Planning Commission, or will we have other chances to look at these as they get modified or expanded?
As we start to hone in, you saw the earlier version. As we start to really develop those, yes, you'll have an opportunity to see those before they get adopted. The plan is to present something to the Design Review Board and then back to your Planning Commission as we had before, and then and we're in the process of doing that. We've hired a consultant. We're going to start working through that process. So yes, to answer your question.
Commissioner Samudzi?
Yeah, this is just sort of more for my edification, just to better understand, I guess, the intent or the goals of the buy right process itself. When we talk about objective standards, we're referring exclusively to the design process. Like, there are essentially no other inputs, with regards to like environmental impact that also would require objective standards. Is that correct?
Yeah, the objective standards. So the buy right process is intended to provide an opportunity for housing projects that could go through the process without having to go through a CEQA process. And there are some parameters that requests for these projects would have to comply with, including level of affordability, depending on what the legislation is that we're using. SB 35 has different obligations than the AB 2162, but there are parameters that the applicant must meet before they may request the buy right process. But so yeah, it would be strictly, for the most part, objective design standards that we're talking about. We're not talking about environmental review. We're talking about objective design standards.
So to follow up with that, then, what are those parameters up front? Because I guess my concern here, and it's not specific to this project. Actually, it's not about this project at all. But the concern here would be that in the push for more quote unquote affordable housing, it looks like, I think it was on page 10, where it showed sort of the deficit at different levels of income, where the extremely low is essentially none at all in terms of what our quota is. I guess the concern that I would have here is, we're dealing with issues, say, specific to downtown with regards to traffic, where we have approved several large-scale projects, and so we anticipate over the next 2 to 3 years, things getting worse. The cost of retiming the lights is essentially prohibitive at this point, and so we're still kind of stuck trying to figure out how to manage that while still hitting these RENA requirements. So I guess the concern here is, are there no other opportunities under the law to assess, even in a buy right process, whether, for example, we just don't have the infrastructure to necessarily support that additional development, even though we may have a requirement to build, X number of additional units for this particular income class?
It's a good question. Right now, the way this legislation has been written and the way we are obligated to implement it, it would be without an environmental review process. So it would be, it's a good question.
Yeah.
It's something that I can look into further, and we can have some of those answers when we bring back the buy rights.
Okay.
discussion. But yeah, that's a really actually great question. I think it's something that all cities in the state are struggling with.
Okay. Fair. That was all the questions I had. Thank you.
I would just add on that the state law makes it pretty clear that the intent is to not subject these projects to CEQA.
Yeah.
And that is concerning to many, but it is very clear in many different sections in almost all of the new legislation related to encouragement of affordable housing and emergency shelters, supportive housing.
So to that note, is there any follow-up from either these laws or language in these laws that suggest, for example, any negative externalities that are caused by sort of forcing cities to build X number of units? So, for example, if we run into, say, like power issues or water issues or other issues like that, is there any remuneration of the state, or the state is just like, all we care about is build more housing and we'll deal with the problems later?
I don't recall seeing anything in any of the legislation that has anything related to that. I don't know if any of your commissioners have any input they might want to provide, but I don't recall seeing anything about, if you are within, although I do recall seeing something in one of the legislations about within a WUI zone. Do you have any?
Yeah, I think you're raising really good points that staff may not be in a position yet because the courts are going to probably decide some of it.
Got it. Okay.
So I think being mindful that a lot of that, there may be in some of the legislative intent a little bit of that discussion. I have a feeling these by right updates will continuously change because of the infrastructure issue that you're hitting on. But I think overall the position is housing has to be built. Cities deal with infrastructure later.
Got it.
Any questions from any other commissioners before we move on to the applicant? Hearing none, I'd like to invite the applicant to approach.
Pat Cousins from Frederick Devine Associates Architects, and I'm going to be speaking on issues related to the building, and Mary Kay Sweeney and Paul Fordham are here to answer any questions you might have related to the use permit, and thank you. I'll keep my comments brief. I just wanted to hit on
Patrick, could you move the mic just a little closer to your mouth? Thank you.
Yeah, better?
Better.
Okay. First, a couple comments about the general plan amendment and zoning change. I would just like to first make the point that this site has, as you know, has been, for all intents and purposes, high-density housing since 1986. The second point would be that the parcel has a direct adjacency to the zoning proposed. It's not like this is an island of isolated in another zoning. It's directly adjacent to it. And also, it's located in a block that's really a transitional block. Every residential building all the way along here has a common property line adjacency with the light industrial office zoning. So that really is no different than this adjacency right here. There are actually a few, it was mentioned there's a few units of housing directly across here. So the fact that housing is kind of bleeding down into this area is not, totally unprecedented. There's housing right here. Then the next points I'd like to make are related to the architecture and the use permit, how our design is trying to assist Homeward Bound to manage this site in the optimal way, and also respect the neighbors as much as possible, given the size of building we're trying to do. For that reason, the pedestrian entrances are all highly visible and well lighted and are facing harbor and located more toward the corner. They're all very open and manageable. The vehicle entrance is on Mill Street, exact opposite end of the residential adjacency we're worried about. The side and rear yards are closed off to access. They'll be fenced. There'll be open fencing so they can be patrolled and monitored. I think it would maybe help for people that or commissioners that weren't here at the last walkthrough we had to go briefly through well, we're not getting there. Just to run briefly through the building. First, parking. One of the primary goals was to get as much parking on the site as possible. So in this plan here, which is the ground floor, we're allowed in this flood zone to do what's called wet waterproofing. And so took advantage of that. It's a complete concrete structure. You're allowed to have your parking, some limited storage, and then anything related to exiting the building can come down to that level. So got 2 stair towers, this parking structure, elevator, and then some storage. You can see that this parking pretty much fills up the whole site. So the goal was to put in as much parking and address that issue as much as possible. We had numerous meetings with staff as to the building design to get this to be a manageable building that the staff that runs the emergency shelter can safely administer and control access to. And then the same is true on the upper floors. There'll be one staff member permanently on each floor that's in charge of each floor. And any questions you have about how this is all handled or administered can be directed to Mary Kay and Paul Fordham. Lastly, we worked to I think we'll go back to we're almost there. There we go. The idea with this building design, in terms of how it looks from the outside, was to keep the elevator core and this stair, which are the tallest portions of this structure, adjacent to this big open paved area, which is the corner intersection, and then everything else try to minimize its height by doing a residential style roof and lowering, because if you're looking up to it, this is really your perceived height of the building. And that's at about 41 feet off the ground. These other elements are taller, but this open space lets it kind of visually be handled to have, a taller building like this in this area. The, again, the entrance and most of the activity will be down at this end. The car activity will be down this end. The closest residential will be down here. That was all an attempt to keep those things separated as much as possible. On the backside of the building, there aren't any, as you'll notice, there's a terrace here on the backside facing the Marin Subaru's storage lot. There's a couple terraces facing it, but none are facing this property. That was intentional. Anyway, if you have any questions related to the building, I'll answer them. Or if you have questions of Paul and Mary Kay, I can get them up here.
Why don't we hear from them first, and then the commissioners will call you back up if we have questions of you, if that's all right with you.
Hi, I'm Paul Fordham. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at Homeward Bound, and I'll just speak very briefly to the program and really let you ask questions. This seems more appropriate than me going on about things that may not be relevant. But really, we've been at this site since 1986. It is one of the few emergency shelter sites in Marin County for homeless adults. We've been serving this population of homeless adults on this site since then. It was a former chiropractic office, and so in '86 it was sort of converted internally to have these large shelter rooms in it, which are not really ideal for the use. But what we're looking to do here really is create a better site plan for that use and add 2 floors of supportive housing, because we know that housing is key to ending homelessness, and because we've had this use at this site, we know that there's people who really can benefit from supportive services with 24-hour staffing. This type of housing doesn't exist elsewhere, where there is security and 24-hour staffing. So I think there were some quite concerns about both maintenance and security on site. So I want to really emphasize to you that the current site, we try and do the best we can to keep it well landscaped and tidy and clean, given the constraints of this very old site. With the new site, we would be able to locate somebody dedicated to maintenance on the site, and also we will have 24-hour security 24-hour staffing and security on the site. So on each floor, there'll be somebody there throughout the day and night. And that's intentional, because we want to be really good neighbors, and we want to also provide the best support to people who've experienced homelessness and are transitioning back into housing. I think really that is the main thing to say, other than we're happy to answer any questions about our mission, what else we do at Homeward Bound, or the type of program activities on this site. Really, the whole focus of everything is getting people into housing. So even in the shelter component, we operate what's called housing-focused shelter. It's not people lining up around the block to get in for a night's stay and then they leave again. They line up around the block. That's not how we run shelter. We run shelter where we get referrals from partners. People come in, they get a 28-day stay. As long as they abide by the rules and it's safe, they can stay for 28 days in the shelter. We meet with them, set housing goals, and as long as they're meeting those goals, they can extend for another 28 days. Every interaction is based around getting people into housing. There are some people who struggle in that environment. We ask them to leave. That's why we have security help with that if we need to. It's very rare we have incidents. Police department are very supportive of our program, because is very rare that there's ever incidents on site. So we feel like we're well respected in the community. We really consider ourselves a community-based nonprofit. All of our board of directors live in Marin, are available locally. And so we see this as the next development of the site, which is really adding housing and reformatting crowbarred use into this site to a more appropriate, dignified use. Should I sit down, or do you guys have questions?
Well, I'm going to stay there, and I'm going to ask commissioners if they have questions of you or the architect, and then depending on what that response is, you may leave. So, questions from commissioners. Commissioner Lubomirsky.
Hey, thank you for coming tonight. You guys have an incredible program. I've had a relative who's utilized your facilities, so I know what good work you guys do. The 32, what are we calling them? Permit units, or what?
Yeah.
So how would they work into the system?
So in our language of shelter and housing, we call them permanent supportive housing units. They're essentially efficiency studio units, so they're not full studios. They have shared bathrooms, shared kitchen, shared common space where we have programming. They'll each basically have an individual room to sleep and then common areas. They're referred to as permanent supportive housing in our language. That's sort of a HUD government language. What that essentially means, and what is permanent in this life, but what it essentially means is there's no time limit for people to stay. They don't have to leave after 6 months or 2 years. People talk about transitional housing. You hear that term. That means there's a 2-year length of stay. So for permanent supportive housing, it just means there's no designated exit date. Everybody would have a lease, or we call it an occupancy agreement. It's exactly the same as a lease, apart from it's month to month from the start rather than a 12-month term to start. And if people break the rules of the lease, we ask them to leave. The supportive piece is what makes it a bit different, like permanent supportive housing. That's what makes it different to just general affordable housing. And support means that we are there to help people on their journey. That when people stumble, we recognize we're serving some of the hardest to serve folks, that we want to be there on site to help them get back on track. If they're in just a housing unit in the community with a subsidy, that's great. But if they stop taking medication, or their car breaks down and they don't go to work and then they don't get fired and all those sort of things, we may not find out for a few weeks or a month. Whereas in this setting, we'll know immediately because we have the support on site and the permanent supportive housing. And then the permanent piece, I'll just address that because the ideal of this is that if people can stay there as long as they need it, as long as they follow the terms of the lease. And we have a code of conduct as well, which means they have to be safe in their interactions and non-threatening to others. If they decide they want to leave, we work with the housing authority to get them a Section 8 voucher if they don't need the supports anymore. So they can move on to something more affordable, and then we can move someone else in who needs more wraparound support. And we do see that over time, people really stabilize, get connected with medications, get back to work, stop reduce drinking. There's various reasons people are homeless. Sometimes it can be isolation and total depression. And just having a place to sleep inside and are connected to a community, they're able to rebuild their self-esteem, get a job, reconnect with family, and they move on. They don't need us anymore. So that's the goal, is that we help folks regain their self, find their self and their purpose, and they can stay living with us or they can move on.
In the report, it says that 32 units, they would not have vehicles. How can you be assured they won't have vehicles?
Yes. Well, the people that we are looking to serve here are some of the most vulnerable folks, because we have other programs in the community where they can go if they're more higher functioning adults, or they're in job training for a few years and then they're back on their feet. So in this situation, we don't expect people would have cars either because they just don't have the mental capacity, like struggling with mental health issues, or they don't have the money. So even if they were able to scrape together enough money to get a car, anybody who has a car on our site has to be insured, have license and tax up to date, all those things. And so the folks we'll be serving here won't have the money to do that. And so maybe later a goal is to get a car. Well, that can be a goal for when they move out to somewhere else. But upon when they come in, the folks we're serving don't have cars. You said, somebody once said they went by there today. There's 55 people in the shelter. You probably saw 1 or 2 cars, and they're probably staff. So even in the shelter, before we even get to the housing component, almost nobody has cars. In fact, our neighbors at the VW Wagon Works often park vehicles they're working on in our parking spots at the shelter. I think there's only 9 or 10 at the shelter parking spaces, and we already lend them to our neighbors in the industrial zone because folks who are there already don't have cars.
But there'd be no way to, if a person did, after a year, say, have the abilities to purchase a car, there would be no method for you to kick them out? Or, I mean...
So if they were in the shelter component, what we would do with people with cars is fast-track them up to our New Beginnings Center in Novato. So already the shelter component at Mill Street, we try and move people quickly through into Novato, which is an 80-bed shelter at New Beginnings Center, and there's abundant parking there. So if we have... And that's part of what happens here now. If people have a car and they can afford to have it licensed and insured, usually they have an income too, and we get them as quickly as possible up to New Beginnings Center, where they pay a very meager contribution fee, but they pay something, and then they start saving money to move on. So that would be the same process. Here, we don't have a plan for people to have cars on site in the housing units. We anticipate they won't. If they're able to have that goal, we have one person right now in our we have a project in Larkspur called King Street Senior Housing. There's no ability for parking. It's part of our agreement with the city that residents don't have cars there. And we have one gentleman who parks off-site, and he uses a parking garage, and he pays to park his car in that other site because there's no parking in the area around the Larkspur site. And so a similar arrangement could be made here. If people have that goal, great, but part of it is we'll find a parking garage for them.
So that could be a part of this proposal.
Absolutely, yeah.
If you want to do that. Yeah, and how many, with the wraparound services and counselors and staff, in an average day, how many employees are on site?
So if you think on each floor of housing, and the shelter would be, so each floor of housing would have one person designated on site at all times. So there's 2 people between the 2 floors of housing. And there'll be a little crossover as staff shifts change. And there'll be other services coming on site occasionally as needed. So things like we may use behavioral health from the county might come on site and provide services. Often we'll have other community partners take people to appointments. So they might come pick them up and then leave. The majority really, though, this is people's housing. We'll bring a few services and support on site, but really the idea is we'll get them to appointments elsewhere. And then in terms of the shelter component, we normally have in the current site, 2 staff usually on site. It can flex up to 3 with a program manager on site. So you're looking at a total of 5 or 6 staff with the shelter and the housing units at any point in time. Maintenance staff might live on site or might be housed there, come during the day, do work there, and then go to other sites. But yeah, so 6, 7 staff at a point in time.
And if I can't tell from the curb cuts and stuff like that if law enforcement people are dropping off clients at the shelter or at the facility, would they be using the exterior stairs or would they be parking inside?
I will say to start with, that's not something that happens very often, but it does happen occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine they'd park by the front and get people. This is on the side here would park in front and then use the stairs. But they could be parking inside occasionally. But it's not often that happens, honestly, because once law enforcement has somebody in their car, they have to take care of them until they get them out of their car, and so they often will call us and check if we have a bed if they want to bring somebody in, and then maybe they'll put them in a taxi. Occasionally they'll drive them there. Sometimes look at them there in other ways.
And I couldn't tell from this plan or on the plans that I have, the site plans, in terms of crosswalks or red zones, or how is that layout?
I'm gonna let our architect answer that question.
Thank you.
I think currently there's a fire hydrant right here, and this is all a red zone right there. So that's available if the police wanted to park there.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, and while you're there, is this the landscape plan? Maybe some bigger trees. I mean, I'm just thinking the mass of the building might be somewhat shielded. The lines go down Mill Street, and there's anything. I mean, is there a reason why they're just lollipop trees?
We could go for some taller trees in there. I think I'll talk to the landscape architect about it.
It's an opportunity. It seems like there's no space. Thank you.
So,
Go ahead.
do I understand correctly that you do not have a maintenance worker on site now, but you are proposing to have one, and this is mainly to address the concerns that we heard about the...
So right now we have a maintenance team that's located up at housed our New Beginning Center in Novato, but works on, Homeward Bound has 5 related shelter sites and 12 linked housing sites already. So we house or provide shelter to about 600 people each night in Marin County. But the maintenance team is located in our New Beginning Center right now because of space constraints, even though half the crew is often driving down to San Rafael to work on some of our sites here, or even down to Larkspur. So yes, we see here that there's space for maintenance staff to be located. They can address things on site. They could start their day there or end their day there, and then would be going out to other sites. They wouldn't be housed there the whole time.
Okay.
But there's not, right now, we're crammed into less than half the lot to provide all the shelter. There's no space for any maintenance team to be there or even have equipment there. So the idea here is we built in more storage underneath for equipment, and that we'd have staff who could address any needs there. It's a new building, so hopefully the building itself won't need too much maintenance for the first few years, but we recognize in time it might, and we do, like I said, have other programs in San Rafael and further south.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I did have a question. So if I understand this process, I just want to reiterate this to staff, I guess. Because we don't have any objective design criteria, you're looking for our input on this design, because if we do approve the general plan amendment and the zoning and the use permit, it would not go to DRB. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So I'm curious what your lighting plan is. And so this will be architectural questions. One has to do with the lighting plan, and the other has to do with the back side of the building looking in the windows of the apartment building at Harbor and Canal.
So at this point, we haven't really a solid lighting plan developed, but in concept, this will have lighting to light up this staircase here. There'll be lighting underneath this, and there'll be there's another entrance exit over here that'll be lit, and there'll be some minor outdoor lighting related to this terrace. Everything else will be low security lighting mounted to the concrete podium to provide some security around the building. And but other than that, it's all low lighting, I guess low ground focus lighting, and just the entrances are accented. And then this area here, that's the entrance that also is access to the park, the dumpsters in that area is all lit up. There will be some motion sensor lighting for, and there'll be probably some cameras involved in how those areas are security's handled. The back of the building,
And we're talking about the north elevation, is that right?
yeah, we're looking at this one right here. So at up till this height here, which is at about make sure my heights are right. At about 11 feet here, that's concrete podium. The only openings there are to the parking garage for ventilation and for flood. You know, if the thing floods, it lets the water flow out of it. Other than that, on each floor there should be 5 windows related to this side on each floor. These lower ones are these are little 4-person dorm rooms, and then first that's in the stairwell. Then these are actually there's none in the stairwell. These are 4-person dorm rooms, these are single-person residence rooms, and then the same above that. They are the minimum really required for light and air and exiting that you can have facing that way. There's nothing beyond what is required for exiting, fire exiting, and light and air required for every room.
Other questions? I have a couple. On the landscaping, I did finally see the landscaping plan, and it calls for calorie pairs along the edge of the north elevation, and I'm not sure I can always interpret a drawing that way, but is it your intention, or is it the landscape architect's intention to create a visual barrier to block because I think the emergency shelter portion, the whatever we're calling that, the second floor above the first floor above the podium, is probably going to be right across from those balconies that are on the apartment building on the corner of Canal and Harbor. So is it the intention that the landscaping is to provide some kind of a visual screen there, or do you know what the landscape architect's thinking?
First of all, there's that space is, no one's going to be allowed back there. It's basically you can't supervise it. You don't want people back there. So it's supposed to look good, and then if the opportunity for screening vegetation is there, it should be pruned up high so you can see underneath it to keep that secure. And I think that's a great opportunity to mitigate issues of privacy. We could find a tree species that would work in there that could be taller in that area and more columnar that would, we got about 10 feet to work with.
So you've got the columnar chanticleers now. I mean, it occurred to me that when I looked at the site today, that you have two concerns. You have the privacy of the existing residents in the apartment building, and then you have the concerns of the privacy of the occupants in the emergency shelter. So you've sort of got a two-way issue there, and it
Right.
it seems that maybe some screening would help with that.
I think that's a good solution, and we can work with the landscape architect, and staff can review that when the time comes.
Any other questions at this point? Commissioner Loughran? Yep.
I did have one more, and that is with the emergency shelter and the housing, would there be children are children served here is one question, and are pets allowed is another question.
I think Paul will handle that one.
So there would be no children on this site. We have separate family shelter. In fact, we started in 1974 with a family shelter, and we're still on that site on Mission and Grand. And we have also family housing separate. So there will be no families here. This is just for single adults. Will there be pets? In all of our programs, we don't allow pets, but we do allow service and companion animals. And we have many of those in the programs. And it's fairly easy to get certified if people want to. So, but yeah, no pets for several reasons, but mainly because we want to get people back into housing, and often that can be a barrier to renting. And if people are really, really attached to their companion, they can get their certification.
Other questions? I have another one, Paul. So this is going to be offline during construction. And where are the people who would ordinarily stay there during in the current facility? Where are they going to go?
So, great question, and one that we've given a lot of thought to. So, open to suggestions of a site. We've been talking with various different groups from the rest congregations who used to do a rotating winter shelter at different churches. Are they interested in redoing that again for the transition period? Or also looking to find a site to use the tents they use in the, what's the name of the programs in the city? Yeah, well, either FEMA trailers that the state has available, or the hospitality centers they have in San Francisco too, when they're bringing people out of encampments. There's sort of big tents, pop-up tents you can use, and they're actually available for lease. We don't have to purchase them. So we're looking around the county for different sites where we could house this for 12 months. Well, the reason we haven't got that nailed down is that we don't know when we're going to be through these full approval process, and also concurrently we're fundraising. We've raised a lot of the money for this, but depending on when we start is when we'll need to find the site. So we're either looking at hopefully this fall, or if not next spring, and they're obviously trying to get a site for this fall or next spring for 12 months. Different sites may be available at different times. So we are having conversations, and we'll keep you updated, particularly when we know what our timeline is.
Thank you. Any other questions before we open the public hearing? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to invite members of the public to approach the podium and speak. Remember, 3-minute limit, speak into the mic, sign in when you're done.
Good evening, folks. Voice okay? My name's Rick Simonek. I'm one of the property owners across from the shelter on Mill Street. 3 items to consider. First off, this is a 4-story building as proposed. It's higher than any building that I know of in the canal. It's going to take away our sky and our daylight, and it's going to open the process to more tall buildings in the canal, if that's what you're looking for. And I believe that if you keep it at 36 feet, like it is now, the building will still do a lot of good for the community. So that's one of the 2 concessions that have been requested. I read a concession as a change in your current rules. The other concession about lot coverage is okay with us, or me, because a lot of buildings in the canal are older and we have more coverage than you'd permit anyway. My second question or my concern is that about safety. As this procedure goes forward, and I'm talking about safety for the canal community as well as the clients or the residents of the facility. Mill Street's a very busy commercial street during the day. Harbor Street feeds both the commercial aspects on Mill Street and Front Street, as well as the residents on Canal. Very busy streets. After construction, I do strongly request that the streets are repaired and the sidewalks are repaired, because construction is going to chew up things down there. I'd also ask that the upgraded intersections would upgrade intersections to 4-way stops, signs, to slow down traffic on Harbor Street and also perhaps Canal. And the crosswalks need to be properly marked. I mean, big, bright, yellow crosshatches, whatever you can do, because you're going to have a lot more folks walking around the canal during business hours. I'd also ask that lighting be increased. At night, the intersection needs to be bright. If you're going to have people walking to and from bus stops, all along Mill Street, all along Harbor Street need to be upgraded. And the last thing, as far as safety is concerned, is you're going to have to be prepared to increase street services. I'm talking police, I'm talking parking, I'm talking paramedics. When I read on page 6 that residents will not have cars, maybe they won't. But if you tell me residents won't have cars, then I'll tell you that some residents might not be drug-free. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on here, and there have been street conflicts. But safety is important. The third item I'd like to talk about is the use permit. Right now we have an emergency shelter, and now we're having an emergency shelter and transitional housing. On page 13, there's terms like households, child care facilities, other support services. Other support services might be classroom, medical, nutrition, don't know. So you're upgrading facility, that's fine, but here again, think it's too high. I think the city's gonna have a very large commitment to safety in a broad sense of the word in the canal, and the use is gonna continually change, I see. Those are my comments. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Did you sign in, please? Thanks. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm John Reynolds. I live in the canal, and our church provides food to Mill Street Center. I've been there every month, and I've been, around the facility and various other times, and they have a very disciplined program. It works well for the residents there. The multilingual, a whole variety of folks who live there and stay there at the shelter. So I think there's a discipline, and there's the Housing First model that really has been working to take people off the streets. This is going to be the Housing First model, the navigation center there that will get people placed. They have housing locators that are helping people get housing. There's other housing that's being developed around the county that can accommodate people if they need to be from transitional housing or not, permanent supportive housing. They can be placed in other places when they get to the point where they have money and jobs, that there are possibilities for that. Increasingly, we're ramping up accessory dwelling units, we're ramping up other housing possibilities. I've been to Board of Supervisors and also the City Council meetings where those things are being put forward for us. In West Marin particularly, there's other land trust operations that are providing places for people to go. So I think it's a disciplined and a creative program that Homeward Bound has, and expanding it to provide transitional housing, supportive housing, permanent supportive housing is going to be a good thing. We need to have that to address the homeless issue that we face in the county, but in the Bay Area and in the whole California and the nation. We need to move forward with the Housing First model that gets people placed, and the supportive permanent housing that will be the midway to that, as well as a shelter to accommodate people that are just down and out at this point. So I really support this. There are architectural issues maybe, and maybe some places that they need to have higher trees or screens. That's a possibility. But I think that just the 18 cars to be placed in the building is fine. And there is the bus stop, and people use the bus. I know I visit with people from the shelter downtown and the library, and these people are very strong, good people that I wouldn't mind relating to. I do relate to a lot of the people, and I think they're good citizens. They'll be good citizens, and we can count on them to not be disruptive. So appreciate your proceeding with this program and actually giving it forth to the City Council to meet all the 4 standards that we have to move forward on. Thank you.
Thank you. Please sign in, Mr. Reynolds. Anyone else?
Good evening, members of the, of the Planning Commission. I'm Judy Bensaka, and I'm here tonight representing the League of Women Voters of Marin County. The League of Women Voters has been a longtime supporter of the work that Homeward Bound has performed over the years to provide housing and services for the population of homeless people in Marin.
Can you please move the microphone down just a little bit? Thank you. Great.
Oh, all right. Every day we become more aware that these services are needed more than ever. For such a critical project as expanding the Mill Street Supportive Housing and Emergency Shelter, Homeward Bound continues to face barriers to housing the homeless. It faces a great need for a 24-hour staff to provide permanent supportive housing. It already owns the property, making it possible to make the best use of the property as it has over the years. In the struggle to end homelessness, it is the group that will continue to provide the best solution in its excellent location in the years ahead. The League believes the City of San Rafael, in partnership with Homeward Bound, will provide the resources necessary to achieve the goal of housing the homeless. We ask the Commission to recommend this project of approval to the San Rafael City Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next.
My name is Liesl Blasch. I'm here with the Marin Environmental Housing Collaborative. MEC is a consortium of advocates building support for projects and policies that advance affordable housing, as well as environmental integrity and social justice. MEC supports the expansion of Homeward Bound's supportive housing and emergency shelter on Mill Street in San Rafael. This is an urban infill project on a site that has been used as a shelter for many years. While the site is in a flood zone that will be impacted by sea level rise, it is unlikely that this project could be sited elsewhere in Marin due to the community's historic resistance to homeless shelters and affordable housing. The addition of a soft floor for staff parking increases the number of on-site parking spaces from 12 to 18 and raises the living space above the flood level. This infill site is conveniently located near to shopping, services, and public transportation, all vital for residents who are likely to be car-free. MEC supports this project because it will provide 32 units of permanent supportive housing that will address an identified gap in permanent supportive housing for the homeless who have significant barriers to obtaining and maintaining housing, in addition to providing year-round shelter beds that are so desperately needed. We believe this project will have minimal environmental impact. We do hear some community concerns about the perhaps disproportionate co-location of multiple services and housing in the canal, a community that is already our most densely populated neighborhood in the county. There are many issues around parking and crowding and the very imminent threat of sea level rise. MEC also, however, works to support the creation of affordable and supportive housing in other Marin communities so that all jurisdictions do their fair share to house the homeless and people who need affordable housing. We know that Homeward Bound also does that. As we noted, it is unlikely at this time that this project could be sited elsewhere, considering Marin's infamous opposition to affordable housing. We are facing an absolute crisis, what our Governor Gavin Newsom called the most pernicious crisis in our midst. Homeward Bound has done well to use existing resources, this current facility, to create additional housing, supportive housing, as well as an emergency shelter. We urge you to approve the requested general plan amendment, zoning amendment, and use permit for this project. Thank you.
Thank you. Please sign in. Anyone else like to speak?
Good evening. My name is Clint Wright. I am a property owner and business owner on Mill Street, and I've been there before the shelter had been established, so I'm familiar with what it does, who goes there, the services it provides. What I've seen this evening is a demonstration of what they propose to build. Is basically limited to what's on the site, on the footprint. There was a comment about how there's public transportation. There's a bus stop a quarter-mile away. So basically, everybody who leaves that place has to walk to the bus stop because there isn't parking. They're not going to have cars. It's a homeless shelter. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody who stays there has a job. It's a transitory. They're in transition. Some have jobs, some don't. So where do they go when they leave in the morning? They've got to go somewhere. They can't just stay on the facility. As Rick had mentioned earlier, the intersections there are very poor as far as, well, they're difficult just for navigating in a car, but for people walking, it's particularly difficult. It's a dangerous area. People drive quickly. It's an industrial area where people show up to get their job done and move on. And everybody there has the same mindset. They show up, they get the job done, they move on. They're not used to having pedestrians strolling along. If they're off to the bus stop, they're going to walk down Mill Street. There's 2 sidewalks on Mill Street. one, isn't very useful for pedestrians. There's telephone poles all the way down. That means to get to the sidewalk that they can actually walk on, particularly if they have a disability, if they need a cane, a stroller, walker, whatever the case may be, they have to cross the street. There aren't any crosswalks. They need stop signs, needs to be well lit. Things need to change if you want to go through with this project. I'm not against the project, but there isn't enough about the safety in the area. Many of the people who go to the facility now are not in the best shape mentally and physically. I'm not a doctor, but I've been there for years. I see them every day. And as a layman, I can tell you these people aren't the best mentally and physically. So unless things are provided for them, lighting, good sidewalks, stop signs, crosswalks, there's going to be accidents. There are large trucks, double parked all day on Mill Street. The intersections are very busy. The people that work there are moving to try and get a job done. These are things that have to be addressed. And if they aren't, there's going to be accidents. All the good thoughts and all the good hopes and wishes just be dashed as soon as somebody gets hit by a car. Unless plans that have not been mentioned today are put in place, it's going to happen. More, if it is a transitional place where people are looking for jobs, it's going to be people who work night shift. There's not enough light. Coming and going, it's just going to be dangerous. Something has to be done in that regard. Otherwise, somebody's going to get hurt. And the people who work there, they're not the ones who are going to change. The truck drivers aren't going to not double park. They are going to continue to unload things with forklifts, heavy stuff. They're going to be moving. The people they work with are familiar with those surroundings, and the people who are going to that facility are not. So there's a lot of safety stuff that has to be done off-site. And off-site starts at the curb. There was talk about dropping people off on the sidewalk at the front where the steps are, where there's the trees, which would be bigger trees. There's parking spots there. They will not be open. They will not be open for anybody to drop somebody off because they're constantly filled. Somebody leaves, it's filled within a minute. The idea of the cops dropping someone off in the red zone is foolish. I mean, that doesn't work. Is there going to be a spot where they can pull into the facility? If the parking entrance is on Mill Street and there's what did somebody say, 12, 18 spots, they'll be full. How many people work there? They're not going to walk there. Nobody wants to walk into the canal. They're going to be full. There isn't anywhere for the authorities to drop somebody off. Oftentimes, I don't know what the frequency is, but it's often paramedics show up. That's a full fire truck, the paramedics van, they double park, they block the street, and they block the street at a spot where it's very difficult to drive around a double parked vehicle. So I'm not telling the firemen to go somewhere else. I'm telling you it's not set up for this sort of thing. So if you build it...
Could you, about 30 seconds. Okay.
Okay, if you build it, you got to make the infrastructure or something around it safer. Otherwise, there's going to be accidents.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. My name is Linda Jackson. I'm here with the Aging Action Initiative. We have over 250 agencies, community-based organizations, and let's see, health sector that work for the well-being of older people in Marin. I just met today with one of the commissioners from San Rafael who serves on the county's Commission on Aging. She is a health navigator. This year, for the first time, she has 4 clients who are homeless. They lost their partners, they lost half the rent when their partner died, and now they don't have a place to live in San Rafael. This is going to be an increasing problem in San Rafael and throughout Marin County, so it is desperately needed. There's a couple of comments, one about MMWD and water supply. MMWD plans for the future growth of water needs in all of Marin, or in their service district, and they have made it emphatically clear that they have the infrastructure and they have the water for the growth that's planned. These 60 beds and 32 units are, if you will, a drop in the bucket of the need, of the demand that's going to be caused and served by MMWD. For design, I like the idea of tall trees for tall buildings. That does a long way, and you can see there's a tall tree right to the east of the building, doesn't have any leaves on it, but you could see if it was leafed out. When it is, it would make a difference in the appearance of this facade. As far as height goes, 400 Canal is 4 stories. It's the landmark building in the canal at Canal and Medway. And there's a couple other residential buildings in the canal that are 4 stories. So this would not be the first nor the only in the canal. About lighting, we have to be careful because too much lighting makes a whole area looks like a Christmas tree all year long, and it's not very residentially, it's not friendly to the people who are living in the building to be all lit up. So you want it safe on the street, but be careful about requiring too much lighting. And there's a lot of good comments have been made about pedestrian safety in this area, so those can be addressed. There's a real challenge for housing for people with throughout the state of California. We're losing our housing that's affordable to low income and extremely low income households. This will make a big difference. There's a gentleman who's sleeping right outside those double doors tonight. So in the name of that person and the people that we can house, I really hope you will support this tonight and make a difference for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to speak? Hearing none, I'm going to close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission. At this time, do any of the commissioners have further questions for staff before we start talking about the 3 items, the environmental review, the merits of the project, and the request for input on objective standards?
Yeah, I have a question for staff about some of the comments that have been made about pedestrian safety in the area, also lighting, crosswalks, 4-way stops. I'm wondering the extent to which that's been addressed or investigated, I guess, by staff.
So there is a limit to the amount of off-site improvements that we can require. However, with any building permit application, our engineering division always reviews and evaluates the need for improvements, such as some of the improvements may include things like, accessibility at the curbs, crosswalks if needed. So we would be reaching out to our engineering division to provide with some feedback on that. In terms of lighting, we have a maximum lighting requirement, based on measuring foot candles. So we would be looking for that. Not other than that, I don't know that there's a whole lot that we can require. Our typical standards are the minimum necessary to provide adequate lighting, and that is not considered objective. So it's kind of a quandary.
I do understand that when these other departments and divisions get involved, I mean, the time to investigate and come up with conclusions and meet and communicate and to be able to move forward, it can take a whole heck of a lot longer. At the same time, it sounds like there is a concern or an issue of safety, and at the very least, what about a couple of strategically placed crosswalks that aren't there? It seems to me that may not take particularly long, and I'm wondering if staff might comment on at least some minimal steps to be taken, and then with some kind of a monitoring thereafter.
Yeah, I mean, we could, I guess one response would be that we could require a crosswalk or 2 because we have designated standards for crosswalks that could be considered objective. I'm just trying to figure out what we would tie that to. We have a use permit where we are allowed to apply objective performance standards. So let me think about it for a minute. See if I can come up with a solution for that.
Can I add something to that? So it sounds to me that the safety concerns exist as they are right now. So my suggestion is that we don't wait for the building permit application, that you notify Public Works. I'm not sure if the speakers have contacted Public Works about these issues, but Public Works has programs to address these accessibility issues, this pedestrian safety, especially if striping needs to be reestablished at the existing crosswalks. So I suggest that Public Works is made aware now. And then at the time of building permit, they can work with the applicant as far as what they can incorporate into the, what needs to be done. But I think Public Works has an overall program for the city to address all of these issues. And we don't have to wait to the building permit application.
Yeah, if I can respond to that, we do have a team that does meet regularly. That's I believe traffic or transit coordinating committee that it's a group of police, includes police, someone from engineering, traffic engineer, someone from planning, someone from parking services that does evaluate these types of questions. So it's something that we can do.
And I suggest to the speakers to reach out to them as well. Not staff will, but do make those concerns to Public Works.
So is it possible prior to City Council reviewing this for the Department of Public Works to do some type of assessment to say, well, what will the impact of this facility be on adding people at that intersection, and what recommendations do they have? What work is going to need to be done? Because that's either going to be a city expense or an applicant expense. But if the City Council doesn't know what that is prior to approval, then they don't have all the information.
Yes, we can do that.
Other questions of staff?
Is there an existing rule or limiting car ownership or car use? I think there were a couple projects maybe in with older residents that I don't know if it was mandated or required, but do we have anything like that in the city right now? They would forbid the ownership or use of vehicles?
Nothing that I'm aware of.
The new whistle stop doesn't have, the residents can't have vehicles.
They can't. They can't.
It's a case by case.
I'm just thinking through the objective standards that we can apply. They do have to be written objective standards, something that's already in place. And so I think one approach might be that we could ask the applicant to commit to that, and ask them to, if there is something I heard was that when there's a goal to acquire a vehicle, that they work with the residents to look for alternate locations. So that might be one way to address this.
If I may kind of weigh in on that, I think I've heard a good explanation about what Homeward Bound does with respect to this and their expectations, and I think asking them to commit to not let anybody have a car is both unrealistic and perhaps unhelpful to the population they're trying to serve. I can see an objective standard that might say no more than X percent or X number of people can own a car, but I don't think the objective standard that says it places the operator of an emergency shelter and supportive standard to ensure that their people who are trying to make a new life for themselves don't have a car. I'm not sure that's something we want to even do as a policy matter, so I'm
But you're talking about an area that already has no parking, 0 parking, and 32 long-term housing units. So I think we absolutely do have to. I think that is one of the major issues I have with this is only 19 on-site parking. So I think I could maybe get through it if there was a statement that residents, permanent residents, wouldn't have cars. But there's not room for another car in the canal. I know because they park in front of my house on weekends, and I'm 2 miles away. So that is a real issue for me.
I thought.
Any other question? I'm sorry, I know we're getting into our deliberations here. I'd like to get commissioners to get a chance to ask staff any more questions they might ask. Yes, Commissioner Samudzi.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify, when we say the objective standards, you referenced earlier that they have to be based on some previously existing regulation somewhere within either civil code or...
Correct. They have to be adopted, something that an applicant can refer to and be clear, so that when they submit an application, they already have something that they're measuring against. And so if we're applying a new standard, although it may be objective, it's not something that was already written and available to them. Another thing something I would note, though, that Janie just reminded me of, is that the application in the project narrative, they did indicate that the residents would not have vehicles. So I don't know if that's helpful in addressing your concern, Commissioner Lubersky, but
Yeah, if you guys stated that you have it, if it exists, then in Corte Madera or whatever, I'd love to see it. And you can, can you see Andrew? Is that okay? Through the chair?
Yes, it's fine.
From Homeward Bound perspective, we are very happy to put in the use permit, which is what we did with the city of Larkspur, that for the housing units, people are not able to own cars, that there's no parking on site. We talked to Whistle Stop that was referenced earlier, that they have no parking, and they said there's such a dire need for housing. There's many people who need this type of affordable housing who will happily forego car ownership. As stated before, the people we serve, we don't believe will have cars or be able to afford them. And in the Larkspur site, physically, same thing, there was one parking spot on the property, and the residents were concerned about street parking. So we said, there's so much need for senior affordable housing in that case, that people will forego car ownership, or there's 20, 30, 50 people in line who don't own cars who will take those spots. So we're happy to have that in our use permit, which is what we did in Larkspur, or just to make that agreement on the record. And then the other thing a couple of things just wanted to pick up on was that we talked to the architect, we were brainstorming how we might be able to build in a loading zone, which would allow for that kind of drop off, or some of the other concerns wouldn't have somebody parked in it. And we'll work with city staff to make sure that's done appropriately and in the right place. And there was a comment about repairing any sidewalks or roadways that get damaged. We will, of course, do that. When we finish construction, everything will be done. And if there are requirements for crosswalks, we will absolutely apply with that. And I would just say there is a lot of people living in the canal right now, in the area you saw all the residents behind. And there's a concern right now for those people not having crosswalks and stop signs and traffic. So I hear the concerns made. I think it's very valid for the people who already live there. Really, the shelter population is going to be about the same. It's just a better site. We're adding 32 people who, many of them are going to be in those housing units and they're going to stay inside most of the time. But we hear the concerns, and if it would help, we're happy to do what we can with the constraints of our site to meet the community needs. We want to be a good neighbor in the community. Sure, yeah. Yes.
When somebody parks their car, is there access to the building from the garage, or do they have to come back out onto the street?
So when staff, I think the question is sort of when they park in the underground parking, so they pull into the parking, do they come back out? Let's see. No. It's accessed from within the parking site. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so just coming back, because I hadn't finished asking my questions when we jumped into the parking. So we had talked about, just going back to the objective standards, because again, I just want to nail this down as to what sort of parameters we have. What are the specific sort of existing statutes or laws that we can refer to? Do we have like a sort of like a list of what those are? And then, at some other time, I can kind of dive into those to find some things. So I guess the purpose of that question is, I know that potentially the focus was on architectural design, but given some of the other considerations around infrastructure, I think that it's fair to also throw in infrastructure as part of what that design would look like, including things like the safety issues that were referenced. I personally think that we still need to have some thought around environmental impact to whatever degree is possible, even with the by right process, because again, given that we're talking about rising sea levels and things like that as like realistic concerns for this site, it should then go into without saying that, okay, well, we also need to think about if we add 300 more units in this particular location, are we able to then maintain that from a safety perspective if some event due to climate change were to happen? Things like that. So that's where I want to, if we're limited to then looking at existing laws or things, I just want to see if there's some body of law that we can actually look to kind of piece some of those out too.
To your question about the existing standards, under page 11 is where, at the bottom of the page is where we start discussing objective development standards, and those are specific to things like setbacks, lot coverage, height, that sort of thing. And then further on, we talk about performance standards for the emergency shelter, which is on page 13. So those are the two locations where we have identified what we are able to, the development standards that we're able to apply because they're already part of our code. Yeah. I didn't go into standards related to roadway improvements, but there are standards that are related to roadway improvements that we could apply because they are written, they're already in place, and that we could apply those through the building permit process.
So the two that you mentioned, those are both municipal code. Are there any other sort of bodies of law that we should look at, or just focus on municipal code for now?
Focused on municipal code for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Other questions of staff before we bring it back for deliberations?
Yeah, I have a question about police car parking. There was a little bit of a back and forth about that, and and there was just, I think, kind of an off the cuff type of answer, so I didn't know if how deliberate of reflection is necessary or typical on that front, here, and if you could speak to that. What I'm wondering, what I'm asking this because if it's possible to avoid, police cars double parking, I think of double parking generally as being less safe. If there's some way to avoid that.
So they
part of the process.
One response would be that their garage would be locked, and we're typically the fire department, paramedics would ask for some sort of a ability to access through a Knox box. So perhaps that is a way to address that question. I don't know whether that's always going to be used in an emergency situation. And if there's an instance when somebody's dropping somebody off, that to me it seems like the response that Paul, the applicant, provided seems reasonable. They're going to receive a call. My guess is somebody's not going to be dropped off without really knowing whether there's a spot for them at that location. I don't really, perhaps this is really more of a question for the applicant than for staff.
I have a comment, just follow up.
Yeah,
My
I don't know. I just don't have any baseline
Well,
of an understanding. So
the
I don't know
nature-
if this is something of concern or if this is something that's just not of concern.
I think Mill Street runs on double parking. It's the nature of it and the configuration and the nature of the business. So I'm not worried at all about a police car full of lighting that the world knows is there, double parking at any time of the day. That's not a concern I have, just based on the business that Mill Street
Okay.
runs. That's double parking.
It's yeah
necessary
yeah,
evil.
Okay. Well, I'd rather ask the question and have it thought through. And if it sounds like it's not a problem, then it's not a problem. And you'd agree this is a secondary, tertiary issue, really.
It's not a frequent thing that happens. I think we'll have the loading zones.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Any other questions of staff before we bring it back for deliberations? Okay, hearing none, I'd like to start our deliberations, and I'd like to break it into two parts. That is the environmental, the adequacy of the initial study and the environmental review and the recommendation to the city council that the project, if it is approved, be approved with the mitigated negative declaration. So we start with discussion of that at this point, and I would at the end of our discussion I would entertain a vote on the approval of the resolution recommending approval of the environmental review. Anybody like to start on that one?
Yeah, I think it's fine. I'm happy to make a motion that we approve the resolution with the M&D as proposed in the package from staff.
Is there a second?
Second.
Third? It's been moved and seconded that the commission approve the resolution in the form attached to the staff report. It's the resolution recommending to the city council adoption of an initial study mitigated negative declaration. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed?
I'll abstain.
And one abstention. The motion carries. Let's move on to the merits. The merits consist of three resolutions. The first one approves a recommendation. The first one is a resolution recommending to the city council the approval of a general plan amendment to change the zoning of the site from the current industrial zoning to high density residential. The second is second resolution is to adjust the zoning map consistent with that, and the third is to approve recommending to the city council that the city council approve the project and the terms of the proposed use permit. So I'd like, anybody want to kick off?
Are you,
Commissioner Loughran?
you're looking for our comments on all three of those combined? Is
Well,
that
I think
correct?
they're all, it's going to end up leading to the approval or not approval of a recommendation to the city council to move forward with this project. So to the extent that any of those things would I think we have to address all three in order to make it happen. So
Okay, sure, I can lead off. I guess first I would like to thank Homeward Bound for being such a good community partner. In all my time in San Rafael, you all have always been held up as such a good organization doing great work, and so I really appreciate the work that you're doing here. I, in general, understand and the desperate need that we have as a city for housing, and that giving people who are homeless housing first has been shown to be sort of the best way to try to get people back on their feet, which is certainly what we want to do. Given all of that, I don't love this process, to be honest with you, that's being sort of put on us by the state. We have to live with it. The fact that we don't have the objective design standards, I wish we did, and I know we're working on those. We do have some objective standards by which to measure what you're proposing. So given that's what we have, I'm comfortable with doing that. I am comfortable with all three of the amendments with a few caveats. One of which is relative to the use permit, is that in the use permit that the residents are not allowed to have cars. I don't think this would go in the use permit honestly, but well, maybe it would. I am concerned about the residents in the apartment building to the north of this construction. And we talked a bit about taller trees because they have balconies that look out that direction right now onto what I can tell is sort of a one-story building. And if a four-story building comes in, that's going to completely block any view and maybe even light. One of the problems with trees right there is it's on the north side. I'm not a landscape architect, so I don't know what tall trees grow in the shade. But there, I guess I would like to see before this goes to City Council some more thought put into how to create a barrier between the two buildings. Then the third issue that I would like is that the Department of Public Works spend some time looking at this and looking at the safety issues. I think the public made some great comments around this, and I really appreciate you coming down here tonight and talking to us about what Mill Street's like every single day and what Harbor Street's like is really, really helpful to us. But I think that City Council should have a sense of this, a stronger sense than we do, before they consider these three proposals. So that's what I have to say.
Okay. Other end, Commissioner Schaefer?
I think those are all really good comments. I think also I understand the concern about adding a building of substantial height to the area, but I don't think it's going to dramatically impact the neighborhood just by virtue of that fact. I think ultimately, even if it were, you weigh that maybe downside to the community against the community need for this, and I think the overwhelming answer is that we need something like this, and especially I think this is a fine location. So I'm not concerned about the height. I do appreciate Commissioner Loughran mentioning the screening and the privacy issue. I feel a little bit behind the other commissioners who were here in December at the other meeting on this. I was unable to make it, so I do feel like I'm catching up a bit. But as far as development of, and I'm going a little off here, but the objective standards, maybe what I need to do is go watch the video of that prior meeting, and that'll help fill me in. But I just feel like I'm swimming with I don't know even what questions to ask. It just seems like it would be a daunting task for someone working full time, and here we're volunteers, and it just seems like it's hard to stab that beast, when we meet just twice a month, and maybe just some kind of further. I just need to go offline and outside of these meetings and do my own research, I guess, just to learn more about what that would look like, and maybe what it could mean is I'll give you a call. Or maybe you could send an email out, or just something. I do just feel like I'm swimming, and I'd like to be able to provide some guidance and direction and advice in that regard, but I don't feel qualified at this point to do so. But anyway, but putting that aside, I think that this is a good project. Obviously, it's there are always going to be some downsides to every project. That is the case here, but I mean, there's just an overwhelming need for something like this, and we need to help getting people into housing, because that's really the first step in helping solve so much of a housing crisis, and homelessness, et cetera, that we have. So I'm in favor of recommending approval of these to City Council.
Thank you. Commissioner Samudzi, are you ready?
All right, so I'll start with the objective standards. I think, after my lots of questions, I have a better grasp of areas that we could provide some input. I will be reviewing the municipal code. I know it's going to take me a little bit, but I think there are concerns that I have, not specific to this project, but just in general around, since this is kind of like a pilot for what this by right process is going to look like. I just have some concerns around the idea of build lots of units first and then deal with the infrastructure later, because there may be some like real economic consequences. I mean, we're seeing it in the city of San Francisco right now, right, where there's not enough housing, so there's negative net migration right now in San Francisco, and I think now in Oakland as well, and that we're going to feel repercussions of that in 4, 5, 6 years. So I think that a lot of these things are interconnected. So I think with regards to objective standards, I know the discussion was initially limited to architecture, but I think that we could stretch the scope of what the word design means a little bit more to include some of those other concerns. With regards to this specific project, just one interesting anecdote is that the location of this spot I think is actually really great. I'm sure you guys know this. You did your research. I work out at Tamalpais CrossFit a lot, and I see a lot of the activity of folks that presumably may use those services at some point. And it just seems like it's a good location for that, because it's right next to that big parking lot where a lot of times they'll hang out, if they're not at work or whatever. There were some concerns raised about the 4-story building, and they make sense. I think though, one thing to consider is that, if we are looking at this from the standpoint of the guidelines from the state, I mean, we do have to build the units, and that does mean that at some points we're going to be building 4-story buildings, exceeding height restrictions, changing the use. That means that some people are going to lose their views. We live in a high demand area. People want to live here, and if the mandate from the state is that we need to provide housing for them, then we have to do it. So I think from that standpoint, I have no issue with the either the changing of the zoning or the use permits. I think for me, I think that's pretty much it. That I'd be comfortable recommending this. I would say, and I don't know how we'd want to word this, but I do think that in addition to the applicant talking to Public Works, I personally have not interacted with Public Works, so I don't know how responsive they are or how willing they are to play ball with these kinds of things. So I do think that it would be helpful to include some kind of recommendation for them to be engaged with this in order to help spur things forward from the safety perspective, because I do think that the issues with the crosswalk and lighting are things that do need to be discussed. I don't know what extent. We don't necessarily need to be prescriptive here, but they do need to be looked at. Those are all my comments.
Thank you. I'll switch over to the other side. Commissioner Lubomirsky.
Thank you. First of all, Homeward Bound does a wonderful job in our community, and you guys are to be commended. You guys work with marginalized members of our community, and you do it every day, and you do an incredible job in our county and our community. I don't know if this is the best place for this facility. I think that it offers more density in the most densely populated area we have in our city, and I wish there were some other location, because I think it would be better for the canal. I mean, the canal. This is not something that neighborhoods want in their community. Okay, they just don't. It's accepted, it's needed, but it's not something that they have sought out. So that should be said. I don't have a problem with the map adjustment, because industrial is residential is all around, so I don't have a problem with that. I would hope that that added to the use permit would be no cars, and you've agreed to that, and that's a good way to go. There should be a barrier between this 4-story building and the existing apartment building, perhaps something as simple as frosted glass on the lower hung window that couldn't open. so you'd have access air above, but you wouldn't have a line of sight into the neighboring apartment building. Something as simple as that could be done. Something has to be done if this number of people are going to be using public transit, traveling down Mill Street. We do have to do something about the lighting and pedestrian access on sidewalks and crosswalks, and that's needs to be done in the canal anyway. But hopefully this will spur that to happening. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Commissioner Davidson.
I'm going to be short. I echo Commissioner Loughran's comments. I think it's better that Public Works has information for council when it does come in front of them. And same thing with the lighting issue. So I'm in support of that, and I think that information should be available to council when they make their decision.
Thank you, Commissioner Mercado.
Yeah, I don't have much. You guys did a great job since you were here last time, so thank you. I think you addressed a lot of the issues. You know what you got coming at you with the city council. Got to deal with the neighbors, the height issue, the bulk and mass, the off-site improvement issue, have TBW involved, have a story, have an answer. Otherwise, you're going to probably get some pretty aggressive pushback, maybe even a request that you do some off-site improvements that you otherwise wouldn't have to do. So I would have a really strong story for how you do that. I think staff did a really great job. This is complicated, the objective standards. If we want to go into that, I have some thoughts. Or if we want to get this portion done, then we can get into that. To what I think the Planning Commission has brought up, you guys are being asked to create something with no guidance that goes against common sense, i.e. infrastructure. So kudos, because it is really challenging. I think we're definitely there, and I'm really glad this project got separated out, because it'll make it much more digestible.
Thank you. Well, I get to go last after all the smart people have spoken, and I really appreciate all the comments. I really appreciate what the applicant's done. Thank you, staff, for preparing the report and getting us to this point. Homer Brown is doing a wonderful job, and not just here, throughout the county. I think when Ms. Jackson spoke earlier about the fact that we have someone sleeping outside these chambers tonight, there's no more direct evidence than that of the need in our community. And so I salute you for taking this project forward. I do think that the canal suffers some undue burden, but it's this balancing that has to go on between a community that is burdened with things that other parts of our community don't bear, and the fact that Homeward Bound owns this site and it's been in operation here, and so there's both a history and an experience in this neighborhood, and they own it. That's a big deal, because when people say I'm all in favor of what Homeward Bound does, but I just wish they do it somewhere else, I don't see them offering up a grant deed to another plot somewhere else. So I'm in favor of going forward on this. I will say on the privacy issues between the apartment building and the new project. When I first looked at the plans, I saw it has windows, and they say they're frost. It's frost, not frosted. So if you could add an ED at least on the second floor, that would be terrific. At this point, I would like to call for a motion, and I sense that there are a couple of things that we might want to change to what the staff has recommended. The first is that the applicant has indicated a willingness to add to the use permit language that would restrict occupants of the shelter or the supportive housing, restrict their right to have ownership of vehicles. And I don't know what the exact language on that would be and how it would be enforced, but I think I'd ask for whoever's going to formulate our motion to approve these resolutions to have that in mind, Commissioner Loughran. And also on the public works improvements, I don't know if staff has suggested language. It sounds like that's going to go in the third correct, the fourth resolution with the approving the use permit and approval of the project itself and the height concessions and the lot coverage concessions. So I don't know if staff has suggested language there that would, I think the sense of the commission is that we don't necessarily want to impose a condition on the applicant that it fund all of these things, but we'd really like to see the applicant, have to go to Public Works before the council hearing and make sure that Public Works knows about the concerns that have been raised to see if Public Works has proposed solutions that can be suggested to the city council. If I have the sense of the commission wrong, please forgive me. But with those comments, I would entertain a motion first to approve the resolution recommending to the city council the approval of the general plan change.
Do you want me to go ahead, Jeff?
The general plan amendment, yes.
Okay. So I move that we pass the resolution recommending to the city council that they approve an amendment to the general plan map to changing the existing land use designation to high-density residential.
Okay, is there a second? It's been moved and second that the resolution recommending to the city council that it amend the general plan to change the land use designation from the existing light industrial office land use designation to HDR, high density residential, be approved. Is there any further discussion? If none, a call for a vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Are there any abstentions? The motion carries. The second resolution before us is one to did that one include the zoning map change too?
That's separate.
It's a separate.
Okay. Okay, it did. Okay, the second resolution is recommending the city council approval of concessions for the height and lot coverage and conditional approval of a use permit to allow the operation, to allow the construction.
I believe the next one has to do with zoning.
Yeah, help me. Okay.
If you want, I could make that motion.
Yes.
Okay. I move that we recommend to the city council that they adopt an amendment to the zoning map, which would change the existing Canal Core Industrial Office zoning classification to the high-density residential zoning classification for this property at 190 Mill Street.
Thank you, Commissioner Lochran. I found that resolution now. Okay, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Is there any further discussion? If not, a call for the vote. All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? There being none, it's unanimous. Motion carries unanimously. Okay, so now I'll get on to the last one. Commissioner Lochran, are you prepared to make a motion with respect to the resolution recommending to the city council approval of the concessions for height and lot coverage and conditional approval of a use permit to allow the operation of a permanent emergency shelter and a new building to be constructed on the property located at 190 Mill Street?
Okay. I believe so. So I will make that motion as was just stated by the chair, but I don't, and I think this is where we're going to need staff to identify how to do this, but with the following changes. One of which is that the use permit would stipulate that the residents are not allowed to have cars. The second would be that additional privacy and shading be provided on the north side of the building. And the third would be that the Department of Public Works is engaged and involved in the process and can provide an assessment on safety and required infrastructure changes prior to city council review of this resolution.
Okay, before I call for a second, do you like what Commissioner Loughran has suggested? It's just as far as drafting of, we're going to have to have a revised form of resolution. The form of the resolution that's attached to the staff report will have to be revised. Aaron, are you comfortable that you have what the motion what's been suggested in the motion can be incorporated in that resolution?
So the one concern I have is that the parking is tied to the use permit that is a use permit for the emergency shelter and not for the residential component of it. And so that would be the limitation, that we wouldn't be able to apply to the residential supportive housing part of it. The use permit is for the emergency shelter. And then the other part of that is the other regarding reaching out to Department of Public Works. I'm wondering if that should be a condition of approval or rather more of direction to staff to assure that we do that prior to the City Council, and therefore it would be our obligation and we would proceed with that, and then present that to the City Council as a desire by the majority of the planning commissioners that they receive some sort of presentation of what that conversation has been since.
Perhaps I could modify my motion then. So I will modify it such that to exclude the recommendation related to DPW and make that a recommendation that staff follow through on that. I think that the north-facing wall and the privacy issues there, that can stay in there. I'm wondering if relative to parking, that yes, this is a use permit for the operation of a permanent emergency shelter, but it's in a new building to be constructed on this property. Can you say, at this building, residents of this building cannot own cars, or whatever that language needs to be?
If I could recommend a different approach, there are 18 parking spaces, and the building shall not, occupants of the building shall not, there shall be no more than 18 vehicles associated with this use. Something to that effect.
How about if as long as no resident of this building may own an automobile that's not capable of being accommodated on site in the on-site parking. And I know we're dealing with, we're trying to make this the model for objective standards, but I'm just not sure we're going to be able to squeeze that peg in on this particular project.
So my only concern is that the use permit is for the emergency shelter. So
Go ahead.
My understanding is that the applicant is already saying by definition those clients or those people do not own cars. So do we really need to have a statement? I hear the definition of the people that are going to make use of the residential. They're not owning a car, and if they are in transition to owning a car, they're most likely not going to be there. Am I not understanding? So they won't own a car.
I mean, if you're asking for a response, I don't know that there's a guarantee.
So I think they have an answer. I heard them say that if they are going to own a car, it's going to be somewhere else.
I just want to make a definition. I think you're trying to between the housing and the shelter. Yeah. None of the 32 studios, people who live there will own a car. The shelter, some people may come with cars, and right now we have those 12 spots on site. Is that right? That are not full all the time, and we lend to our neighbors. So there are a few people that come to the shelters with cars, and we get them as quickly up to the Novato site as possible, and we've never had a problem with filling the 12 spots on site. But the people in the new housing units are not going to have cars. And I agree with Ali, the issue is a use permit's not tied to the housing. We can make a statement to you that people in the 32 units will not be car owners, but I don't think that's in the use permit, because use permit's the shelter. And the shelter is the entry point to shelter. Some people might have split up with their partner and be on the streets for the first time, and they might drive to the shelter. Now, we'll get them up to the other site as soon as possible, but we're not going to know that person until they show up. So at the shelter, people might have a car. We've never had an overcrowding issue, but I want to be very clear about that. Some people coming to the shelter do have cars. We've never filled our small lot that we have with those cars.
So if I may, it sounds like the applicant is agreeing that residents of supporting housing, the supportive housing portion of the project will not own vehicles, and is willing to commit to that. And that's not in the use permit. I understand that, because the use permit is tied to the emergency shelter. However, we could be imposing, to the extent you want to make this an objective standard, is any supportive housing built at the corner of Mill and Harbor shall not be permitted to, shall not allow its residents to own cars. I mean, it's goofy, because but this resolution approves two projects, and it approves two uses on the same site.
The use permit is for the emergency shelter only. The supportive housing portion of it is not a discretionary.
Yeah, it's not within our review. So here's where I think we're conflating the two issues, if I can. The use permit is limited to only one part of the use. The parking we're concerned about, we have no jurisdiction over. So to the extent that the Planning Commission in our lane can only regulate the use permit, then to the extent we want to limit parking to the use permit, they've said they doubt anyone will have parking. However, I think objectively, broadly, we should lay out some foundations for staff as to the adequacy of the site equaling the need for parking. That's the objective standard. Yeah. In this situation, I just don't think the Planning Commission, we don't have the findings to support what the adequacy of parking is here. There's nothing in the staff report. There's nothing presented by the applicant. So if we pick a owners will or will not allow tenants to have, arguably we've gone into a condition that doesn't have objective findings to support it that the city council could quickly oppose. So I would recommend that we have a general objective recommendation that the applicant seems to support, that they intend not to overuse the site by their own needs. They don't want to do that. Then generally, objectively, we need to hone in this portion of our general objectives to have a tight language that says, how can we get a nexus between limiting the parking when we're issuing this use permit? Does that make sense?
Yeah, we don't have a vehicle here tonight to do this. Okay, so.
Well, and just, Chair, this is a really complicated, the last time we came here, it was these layers of complication that kept making my head hurt. And so, again, I apologize if I'm breaking this down too slowly. I'm literally, for myself, reminding myself what lane we can go into.
So if I hear Commissioner Mercado correctly, and I think I do, and I think I agree with him, is that we are really not in a position to impose a non-parking condition for the operation of the supportive housing.
Right.
Yes, for the emergency shelter, the use permit is being issued on that. We can set forth whatever objective standards we believe are appropriate. The concern is the supportive housing. To the extent we're concerned about the residents of the supporting housing having a restriction on their parking, we really don't have jurisdiction under this use permit. We would be restricting their use that they otherwise have already by right. Yeah. So under the emergency shelter, if we want to lay out a restriction as to the parking, we'd have to have a standard that's based off of.
And as you're saying, we don't have an existing objective standard, and the state statute is going to preclude us, in the absence of of having those standards from
Well, I mean,
from imposing that no parking condition.
right, maybe maybe Whistle Stop, or I know there's other projects where the owner does enter into a declaration that limits parking and they have a covenant that would restrict parking. You can have that. We can try to make that recommendation to the city council. I just don't know if really that covenant would only be the extent of the parking, which they're going to do anyways, because as a good neighbor, they're not going to have 15 extra cars coming in one night. So arguably, the covenant would already be doing what they're doing. So I could see that kind of condition where we're imposing it on the owner to restrict it, but that would require a lot more staff work to get that ready for the city council.
Here's another way to do this, and that is we approve the resolution as it's written, but then we direct staff to communicate with the city council what our issues are. Because, and in the interim, that gives staff the ability to investigate, is this something of which we do have any control or can have control, and to collect the background and the information they need, but that our wishes and our thoughts would be communicated to city council.
Right, so I think that, I agree, and I think that ought to be, we don't have to have a drafted resolution. We can do a separate resolution orally following the actions on the resolutions in the form attached to the staff report. And then city council, we're going to make a recommendation to city council. And city council can thumbs up or thumbs down this because there's a general plan amendment requested.
Right, but I don't think I don't think this council needs to pass a resolution beyond this use permit. I think just our voicing what our opinions are, they can be presented to city council with the additional information that is gathered in the meantime.
All right, so there are some people here that feel very strongly about restricting parking, and we're not going to be doing it this evening. So, want to take another crack at your motion before we call for a second?
Okay, so my motion would just be that I move that we recommend to the city council approval of the concessions for height and lot coverage, and conditional approval of the use permit for allowing the permanent emergency shelter in a new building to be constructed at 190 Mill Street.
Is that then strictly in the form of the resolution attached to the
Yes.
staff report?
Yes.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Is there some further discussion? If not, please.
I do. Under section C in the standards, there's item 4, parking and outdoor facilities provide adequate security for staff. In these objective standards, is there a parking adequacy language already? I looked and I didn't see it.
There isn't. I think we were trying to make the connection because there is that language, and separately we received comments from our public works engineer who stated that they felt it was adequate. So,
Okay.
Yeah, there's not. The parking. Sorry.
Are you ready for the question? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Opposed.
No, any abstentions? The motion carries. All right, I'm going to do one more crack at, is there anything more to be said about objective standards at this time that would be helpful to staff before we leave this subject?
I do. I have a. This will be quick. And let me know when you're ready. So if I'm looking at the objective standards that we used in this last approved resolution, number 7, the emergency shelter is not within proximity to any other existing or planned. That's, I think, ambiguous. I think proximity needs to be clarified as to what that means. Number 6? I'm looking at page 3 of the resolution. Oh, the resolution. I'll go back to 11 though. Hold on. I'll look at the staff report.
I guess that's on 13.
13, thanks. Okay. Okay, so yeah, item 6, proximity. Oh, okay, so it's set per the code. And then number 8, or no, where is it? Oh, okay, so, and then number 7, I would add federal to that. Good standing with city or state licenses, I would add federal licenses, because there may be federal oversight or funding that creates regulations that if they breach, they would lose funding rights, and we want to be able to remove that project if they breach that. That's it.
Last chance on objective standards. I just have one comment that I think that putting aside, I think that it's very useful what Commissioner Mercado did on the objective standards for the emergency shelters, but I'm not sure that we're really going to be able to give much input on development standards, design standards, and those kind of things tonight. I think we're going to have to wait for more work to be done, and good luck on that. Okay, that's it on this matter, and thank you all for coming tonight. Thank each of you who spoke. Thank you, Homeward Bound. Thank you, staff. I'll now turn to the next item on the agenda, which is the director's report.
I just have something really brief. I don't have anything scheduled in anything else scheduled in March for a planning commission. In April, there might be some general plan updates coming to you. For DRB, we have March 3rd and March 17th as the next DRB meetings. So I believe we have, I'm trying to remember who's on the next. I'll email you with who's next on the agenda. That's it.
Okay, so I cut you all off last time on commission communications, so if you have your notes from last time about what we were going to say, I invite you to speak now. Please.
Oh, I'll just have an offline. I had actually, no, I'll ask it here. Earlier this evening, you mentioned that San Francisco has a net negative migration, and I was wondering what, as a planner, the significance of that is.
I mean, I guess you have to look at a number of other factors.
That's obviously a huge question for,
Yeah.
but and I was going to ask you offline, but if there is just a very quick thumbnail answer, or maybe we can just take it offline. I'm curious. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I think for a city like San Francisco, because there's so much business that has headquartered there and will be for the foreseeable future, it's probably not as big of an impact. But for a city such as ours, where we don't have the same kind of volume of, say, high-paying jobs, and in fact, I would say that probably the biggest job creation here is sort of like sub $20 an hour, sub $30 an hour, that a negative net migration there could essentially kind of kill off a lot of the small businesses that we have. Because there's like a lack of demand there. Same thing for sort of sales tax revenue, people, actually purchasing goods in our downtown districts, et cetera.
Great, thanks.
Okay, I'd like to, I've got a comment before we adjourn, and if you bear with me, please. I'd like to adjourn tonight's meeting in memory of Linda Phillips, who died unexpectedly on February 13. Linda was the wife of Mayor Gary Phillips. As each of us knows, we could not engage in our public service as planning commissioners, city council members, or members of other public decision-making bodies without the counsel, support, and encouragement of those closest to us, including, especially, spouses and family. I have no doubt all of us are living today in a better city of San Rafael and surrounding community because of the encouragement and support Linda provided to Gary, as Gary and Linda herself provided their unselfish service to our community. It's hard to imagine being unable to share one's post-meeting joys, satisfactions, and frustrations with someone who is willing to listen, celebrate, and console us as only a spouse can do. I ask that each of us keep Gary and his family in our thoughts during this difficult time for them And with that wish, this meeting stands adjourned.